Welcome, English 102 students. Today we're talking about quotation marks. In the last lecture, we talked about plagiarism and the different ways of quoting, summarizing, and paraphrasing, and the in-text citations that go with them. Today we're going to talk quite specifically about quotation marks, although I will review in parts and pieces how to use some in-text citations along with the quotation marks when you do quote. If you have any questions, please make sure that you post them or ask them in class. Quotation marks are used quite specifically to set off and represent exact language, either spoken or written that has come from someone else. In fiction, we also see them as designating speech arts. Most people already know this by the time they get to college, but what often gets forgotten is that in the process of editing, we'll often delete, remove, or forget to use quotation marks. So it's really important when you're reviewing your document submissions in Turnitin that you make sure you've used quotation marks around all exact words, that you haven't accidentally deleted them, or you haven't used the wrong font when you've copied and pasted from an online article or document. So keep in mind that even though I am technically teaching you how to use quotation marks, I'm more like teaching you how to edit for them and how to make sure you haven't made any of those recurring issues or problems that can open you up to accusations of plagiarism, which is something you want to avoid. Quotation marks always come in pairs. Do not open a quotation and fail to close it at the end of the quoted material. This will set off alarm bells in Turnitin, and you'll often get a higher percentage in your similarity report as a result. If you look at the example on the screen, you can see the dog ran into the woods beyond the small trailer. There are no closing quotation marks. Because this is speech from fiction, we don't have an in-text citation, and so the comma goes in front of the quotation marks, and the period goes right after boy. You'll capitalize the first letter of a direct quote when the quoted material is a complete sentence. So if you're taking a complete sentence out of a document, you're keeping the complete sentence with the capital letter, even though you're integrating it into your own essay. For example, Mr. Johnson, who was working in his field that morning, said, space, the alien spaceship appeared right before my two eyes. We're keeping that T capitalized because this is a complete sentence. However, if you're taking a piece of a sentence and you're integrating it into the middle of your own material, you are going to lowercase or keep lowercased that part of the sentence. Although Mr. Johnson had seen odd happenings on the farm, he stated that the spaceship certainly takes the cake when it comes to unexplainable activity. Again, because this is something out of a news report, there is no in-text citation. Now, also take note, here we have a set of quotation marks, but the quotation marks are in different fonts. Typically, what happens when you copy and paste from the internet is the font flattens. The quotation marks, instead of being 66s and 99s, the 66s at the front, the 99s at the end, the first set or the second set might flatten into these straight up and down quotation marks. When instructors are looking for copy and pasted material that hasn't possibly been cited or referenced properly, we look for things like these quotation marks. So as you edit your paper, look for little weird oddities like this that might set off red flags that simply aren't there. If a direct quotation is interrupted mid-sentence, don't capitalize the second part of the quotation. This doesn't happen too often in college papers, but if you do end up doing this, just make sure you have a comma at the end of the first part, a comma after the speech tag in the middle, and then quotation marks around each piece. In all the examples above, because they're from news reports or fiction, the period or the comma punctuation always comes before the final quotation mark. This happens in fiction and news reports, but in college papers, if you are providing an APA or an MLA in-text citation, you're not going to keep the period at the end of the sentence as you would normally. Instead, you're going to move that period from where you might normally find it in front of the quotation marks to the end. So the alien spaceship appeared right before my own two eyes, closed quotation marks, in-text citation, and then the period. If you put a period before and a period after, and you have another sentence after this, it's going to cause reader confusion. They're not going to know if you intend for this in-text citation to apply to the sentence before or the sentence after. So always make sure you omit the period at the end of the sentence and keep it after. When you're quoting text with a spelling or grammar error, you should just transcribe the error exactly in your own text. And this never used to be particularly common, but as more and more publishing happens directly online, a lot of mistakes aren't caught. There'll be a lot of transcribing errors, and unfortunately, this is something you're going to need to do probably fairly frequently. If you find an error or a mistake in something that you want to quote, you can't just go ahead and correct it. You have to leave it exactly as is, or exactly thus. So you transcribe it specifically and exactly into your essay the way that it is shown, and after the error, you're going to put square brackets and SIC, meaning thus or so in Latin. This will make it clear to the reader that the mistake isn't your own, the mistake is in the original. This actually kind of has a dual function to kind of shows your professor that you know exactly what you're doing, and that's always nice. If the original quote is too long and you feel not all the words are necessary in your own paper, you can omit part of the quote. You can't omit just a single word or a single few words. Usually you omit a sentence in the middle of two sentences that you want to quote, or you take out a really long section if some sentence is particularly long. So in the original, as you see on the screen, the quarterback told the reporter, it's quite simple, they played a better game, scored more points, and that's why we lost. Now, when you take the material out that you don't want, you're going to replace that material with an ellipsis mark. An ellipsis mark is always 3 dots in a row. The period is considered separate, so sometimes you have that 4th dot, and it can kind of look a little odd, but it is necessary. In the omitted, the quarterback told the reporter, it's quite simple. They scored more points, and that's why we lost. Now, this reporter didn't do a very good job because she did take something else. She did take something out that changes the tone of the original. If I was this quarterback, I wouldn't talk to this reporter again because they just made me sound like kind of a grouch and kind of a poor sport. So if you're going to take material out, make sure you're not changing the original tone or meaning. If the context of your quote might be unclear, you can add a few words to provide clarity and enclose the added material in brackets. This is typically when you have a pronoun that's not clear because the context is now lost. The quarterback told the reporter, it's quite simple, they, the other team, played a better game, scored more points, and that's why we lost. Sometimes it'll be a character name or an author name that you have to insert. Use single quotation marks to enclose quotes within another quotation. Often, you'll be reading an article, and part of what you want to quote is also quoted material. So you keep the double quotes on the outside, and any quotation marks that appear within are going to get single quotation marks. Here on the screen, we see the doubles on the ends and the singles on the inside. Quotation marks are also additionally used to indicate words used ironically or with some reservation. Now, often people think that they're just emphasizing something, but quotation marks are not used for emphasis. I've often seen sites advertising things that have put quotation marks around words that you really don't want said with irony or reservation. For example, a sign hanging in a restaurant recently said shrimp basket, and they put quotation marks around the word shrimp. So, irony or reservation? It might be shrimp, it could be shrimp, it's ironic shrimp. I'm not sure I want to eat shrimp that might not be shrimp. I want to eat real shrimp. But you can see the person was just intending to advertise, hey, yay, we got shrimp. Let's emphasize this. However, it's not for emphasis. Now, if you're reading this in a paper, often words with quotation marks around them, you might normally put the words so-called in front of them. So if I was reading this sentence out loud, I could read it two ways. The great march of progress has left millions impoverished and hungry. You can hear the tone shift. The great march of so-called progress has left millions impoverished and hungry. So, as you can see, the quotation marks are intended to show doubt, reservation, and there's a very significant tone implied with it. If you don't mean that tone, if you don't mean so-called progress, or you don't mean so-called shrimp, please don't use the quotation marks around that word. Additional punctuation marks. You're going to make sure you use a comma to introduce a quotation after a standard dialogue tag or an intro phrase. Every time you quote material from an article in your own essay, you're going to use an introductory phrase, or you're going to blend the quote into the sentence that comes before it in some particular way. If you just leave a quote in the middle of a paragraph without any introductory phrase or without attaching it to the sentence before or after with a colon or a semicolon in a way that makes sense, then what you've essentially done is just left the quote in the middle of the paragraph for the reader to sort out. It's quite confusing to your reader because then the reader has to figure out why it's suddenly there. You should never use quotes to replace your own writing. So a quote should never stand alone. If you have a quote in a paragraph, you should be able to remove the quote and the rest of the paragraph will still make sense. You put the quote in order to support what you've just said. So you want to make sure you have an introductory phrase or you've blended the quote in the rest of your writing. You're going to keep any additional punctuation outside the quotation marks. This is fairly standard. Quotation marks and exclamation points apply to the material that is either inside or outside, depending on who is saying it. In the two examples on the screen, this is illustrated. Philip asked, "Do you need this book?" The the question mark is inside because that's where the question is. The question is outside the quotation marks, so that's where the question mark stays. If you are quoting material from a novel that uses question marks or exclamation points, include the punctuation inside the QM, but also add a period after the reference. This is a really important thing to do. Earlier, I noted that you had to move the period from inside the quotation marks until after the in-text citation, but this really only applies to periods. When you have an exclamation point or a question mark, you need to keep it with the words because that's the words that it modifies. If you moved an exclamation point after the in-text citation, it would modify the in-text citation. For example, the dog ran so fast that the wind sang, "Jones, 1992, page 4." If that exclamation point was after the citation, that's what it would sound like, and that's just silly. So you want to make sure the exclamation point or the question mark is applying to what it is next to. The reader will understand that this in-text citation applies to that statement. Remember, finally, that quotation marks go with titles of short works. So songs, short stories, essays, poems, one-act plays, chapters, and books. Long works get italics, names of books, names of journals, those get italicized, but you'll always use quotation marks around short things like articles and short stories and poems. That's the end of my comments for now. If you have any questions, please make sure that you post them.